Hello again. So now, to this session, we're going to talk about the role of the government in facilitating an economy adapting to climate change in a way that minimises the costs of changing our decisions and gets us the better satisfaction of being in terms of food, clothing, education, housing, the environment and a community. So some of the government roles. Direct action by the government includes providing information about climate change at a very detailed level to help both its own decisions, but also to provide the information base for individual households and businesses to adapt to climate change. They're also going to have to adjust public funding and support for research and development. So a major part of the strategy of adapting to climate change is recognising that we're in a new environment. We have to do things in different ways. So what are these different options? What are their pros and cons? And how can we best implement them? And government has a key role in providing that information. Government also has a major role for all societies in the conservation of ecosystems and biodiversity. Governments also have large investments of their own infrastructure. In most countries, they're the ones who build and maintain roads, ports, often schools, hospitals, water facilities, sometimes electricity and all the communication stuff. So government has a big role in deciding on how are we going to build these types of infrastructure and how are we going to maintain them in a world where there are differences in rainfall, there are differences in temperature, and there may be more frequent adverse events like storms, floods and bushfires. And of course, in the ultimate role, government is a major provider of community support to those who are adversely affected by catastrophic events. We always look to government to help us get out of very challenging situations. But government also has indirect roles. Remember, in most countries, government is only, say, 30 to, say, 60 or 70% of the economy. The big part of the economy is still the private sector. So the government needs to be setting a regulatory and legal environment so that individual firms and households can themselves change their decisions and adapt to climate change. So let's look a little bit more detail about the provision of information. As we've hinted many times, individual firms and households do need to know data about changes in temperature, rainfall and adverse events as they change their individual decision circumstances and the options. So we need this at a very detailed level. I think we've made great progress at understanding what happens in terms of large regions, even continents, but ultimately, if you're living in a particular suburb or in a particular part of the country, what's the climate change going to be for me? That's the sort of information they want to make better decisions. They also can be facilitated if we provide them with information. What are the alternative decisions? What if I put in a new variety? Will it better handle the changes in rainfall and climate to produce wheat or cotton or strawberries? What are some of the challenges I'm going to face? Will I have to change my production method, my time of planting and harvesting? This is a major role for the government research and extension. Now, why do we really want government involved in this? Well, that's because information has what economists call public good properties. First, it's non-rival in consumption, so that if I provide information about the climate for a particular state or province, the consumption of that by one person doesn't reduce its availability for use by other people. That's what we call non-rival consumption. On the other hand, if I eat an apple, then that apple is not available for anybody else to eat. That's what we call rival consumption. Another property of information is that it's got high costs of exclusion. So if I provide information about climate change and it's taken up by person A, it's very hard for me to stop that person A talking to his or her neighbours about exactly that same information. Or more generally, if I put it up on the web or on the radio or in the mass media, the consumption by one person doesn't deny the consumption to others. And so if we think, what are the incentives for an individual business to provide that sort of information? Well, the incentives are, because it's non-rival consumption and non-excludable, I don't think I'll provide that product. I'll let my friends do that. But unfortunately, my friends do exactly the same thing. Why should I do it? Freeban's a sort of a smarty from a university. He should provide it and I'll get it for free. And so what happens is both of us free ride. We wouldn't get that information provided. So that's the massive argument that economists would use for key roles of government in providing information about changes in climate change, for funding R&D, and for providing information about the relative pros and cons of different seasons that are affected by climate change. And of course the payoff of government providing that information is, yes, it's costly, it takes resources and science and equipment, but the private sector makes much better decisions with that information. And so national productivity rises, the government's happy, its citizens are happy, it's a win-win story. What about direct action by government? Well, governments also have a lot of decisions that they have to make themselves. For example, investment of their public buildings, their roads, their ports, their water utilities, and any of their buildings. They're going to have to make decisions about, do I change those buildings so that they can better withstand changes in climate? And do I have to change my maintenance routines and costs so that they can withstand climate change? In general, we leave national parks and protection of environmental amenity not entirely to the public sector, but a large part of it. And here we include national parks, looking after the effects of bushfires and floods and other sorts of adverse events on the survival of plants and animals that we value. And government clearly is going to have to change the way it sets up these national parks. It may have to create corridors so animals and plants can move north and south or east and west to a climate that's more like they regularly live in. Governments also have major roles in providing warnings for natural disasters. So as we've seen in recent years, warning of even 12 hours, but better still 3 or 4 days of forthcoming floods, cyclones, can enable people to protect themselves much better from those adverse events. And of course, in the event of a cyclone or a flood or a bushfire, governments play major roles in providing people with short-term welfare support and in helping them to rebuild their lives and start again. Another role for government in this challenging game of adaptation to climate change is to help the private sector itself change its decisions about the choice of production method, in some cases about the location of production, so we may have to shift production because of flooding from sea level rises or because of more adverse floods that make us move further up the hill and away from regularly flooded areas. About the form and location of investment, so where are we going to put our big plant and equipment, our mines, our big factories and so on, so that they can better withstand climate change. Perhaps also we might provide information that help people choose what to produce and consume. Such changes by the private sector also require the government to relook at its regulatory structure. Are those regulations really there for good reasons? Now, of course, we need regulations to provide good property rights. We need regulations to overcome problems where there are external costs and benefits. And of course, we've had big discussions of greenhouse gas emissions being one of those market failures. We have regulations to make sure that where we have monopolies, they are not exploiting people and producing and consuming too little of that product. What we want to check is, are those regulations really doing what we want them to do? And are they not causing problems in helping the private sector make any of those above decisions about production methods, location of production, the form of investment, and the choice of what to produce, so that they can better adapt to changes in climate change. So adaptation is an interesting interface game between almost everybody in the private sector and their governments. Bye now.